When I made this document, I tried to put everything I might use on there, even though every batch was going to be a little different. So whether it's a single varietal or you're doing a blend at the beginning, you're doing a blend at the end, you're doing a co-ferment, you're doing a wild fermentation, you're doing a pitched cultured yeast. I find myself in the moment as I'm making a batch, thinking about each of these steps as I go along.
Hello, my name is Ria Wincaller, and I am the producer and cider MC of this weekly podcast, where we speak with makers, cider enthusiasts, and folks within the cider trade from around the world.
Hip, hip, hooray!
Bringing us into this here episode number 407 of Cider Chat, we heard from Dan Gallagher of Frosty Twig Cider. You'll be hearing more about his cidery, but what he was talking about there was a cider log, documenting the cider making process. So this episode is a great one for folks who are just starting to get into cider, or even if you're like myself who has been making it for many years and forgets to write down certain particulars. We're going to be going over all of that. So stay tuned for that featured conversation. But first, we have a wee bit of news from out and about in Ciderville. I was at a dinner party and I was introduced to this woman who my friend said, oh, so-and-so really likes cider. And I said, cool. Well, tell me, what do you like about cider? And she immediately said, well, I don't like dry cider. And that gave me pause. And so I got further inquisitive and said, well, what about it don't you like? And she replied, it just sounds like cardboard. Dry. I want something that has flavor. And there we go. There we go once again. How language can totally mislead people constantly, and probably masses of people. And this is like the upward climb that we're always struggling in the drinks category of bringing the industry in sync with the consumers, the folks who don't want to have to work too hard to figure out what is in that bottle or whether or not they're going to like it. And of course, if you heard, let's say you're going on a vacation and people say, well, it's really dry where we're going, you're going to be thinking, oh, barren, I better bring some lotion. I'm going to probably be parched. Not, I'm going to soak into it necessarily, unless you're like me who totally loves the desert. But, these qualifiers that we use, and they're not going to change. I mean, we're not going to change the scale from sweet, semi-sweet, semi-dry to dry. That's going to be there. It's kind of locked in stone. I just don't see it changing. But what we do have to do somehow is to constantly offer an open hand and bring people along so that they are included and make the language or the marketing in a way that folks can feel part of it, feel brilliant that they have gotten it, and certainly never feel like they're asking a dumbed down question. At the end, we were chit-chatting, got along, and I was able to turn her on to some products to think about and what a dry cider can do. I mean, here in short is basically what I said. When you ferment a cider to dry, that really means that you're allowing that apple or that blend of apples to really shine. And in that process, you're going to get the full essence of the apple. And the apple will always have a residual sweetness to it. And it won't be a sweetness that is gained from sugar or other adjuncts. It'll just be the pure essence of the apple. And that's why we call it dry, because it ferments out dry, but it doesn't mean that it leaves behind all the aromas, the bouquet there, if you will, and the exquisite flavor of that apple fermented into a bottle of cider. I could go on more poetically. I probably did with her, and by the end she was like, let's just go get some cider. And I'm like, okay, let's do it. But, I don't know. I know I'm kind of speaking to the choirs for anybody out there who is in the commercial industry of cider making or wine. But yeah, it's kind of like when I talk to folks about beer and I hear somebody say, well, I don't want a stout. That looks really, really heavy. Well, the truth is that, beer has the same problem. Stout, such as like a Guinness or, a really dry stout, is going to have a very low ABV, alcohol by volume, and it's going to be the lowest caloric beer likely that you're going to be able to drink. It's going to probably be about 4.2%. But this is what people get stuck on. They see something that looks like chocolate syrup and they think heavy. And it's all the way that we have been, conditioned to view the world. And it feels really good when you open up the door and let somebody see a different vantage point from what they were viewing something before. And maybe that's why I keep doing the podcast, which leads me to the next piece, is that Cider Chat is a mega hub for so many different resources for brands out there to talk about with social media, to help cider makers connect with other resources. So really, Cider Chat is a supply liaison, part of like the link in the big chain of the supply chain, helping makers connect with apple growers. Been doing that for years. And of course, there's over 400 episodes at ciderchat.com that you can listen to and find any topic out there in the world of cider. One of the ways that we really encourage further education of patrons is asking commercial makers to download the info flyer about Cider Chat and post it at tasting rooms, or on the shelf or in a store next to the cider. So folks could say, oh, I want to learn more about cider. I'm going to check out this podcast and all the resources that they have at ciderchat.com. So each week, this season 9, we are looking at, is anybody out there in Ciderville helping to cross-promote and share a little bit of news about Cider Chat. And we, once again, have 2 brands out there in Ciderville who know a good opportunity when they see it. And the first one is Wooden Gate Cidery, based in Manitoba, Canada. And they're actually in Pilot Mound, and so that's to the southeast of Winnipeg and just over the border from North Dakota. And what Wooden Gate did was take the Instagram posts that we were pushing out last week featuring Lee Reeve of Insider Japan. That was episode 406, and just reposting it and thanking Cider Chat for the mention. And that's called cross promotion. And because they did that, I'm able to mention them again. So brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And wouldn't you know, Marcel at the Hananer in the Netherlands did the same thing. Reposted something for Cider Chat and put X promote cider. Well, actually, hashtag X promote cider, because that's what I'm really pushing out there. So we could kind of get one type of like campaign going to ramp up the cross promotion. And truthfully, like any cidery in the world can do that. Just make mention of Cider Chat. But what we really want is for you to download the info flyer at ciderchat.com and post it in your tasting room and take a photo of that. And those photos are what we're really going to be featuring out there in Ciderville. Just go to the support page at ciderchat.com, download that little info flyer, boom, put it up there, take a photo, and tag Cider Chat, and you might be on next week's episode.
Walking through the orchards.
Coming up this September 2024 is the French Cider Tour, going to Paris, Normandy, and Brittany. This is a week-long tour. We visit 8 different makers. We have 3 maker dinners with Aguette Laitier of Manoir d'April, Etienne Dupont of Domaine Dupont, and Eric Bordelais of Eric Bordelais. And I have this little clip here with a gal who I walked through many orchards out there in France, talking about her experience on the French cider tour, because I believe that the guests on the tour have the best reasons why you want to sign up for the French cider tour today. So let's roll to that next.
I am neither a cider maker nor an apple producer. I am a cider groupie. I love cider and have been drinking cider for 30 years. One thing I learned about an appreciation for the small cider makers in the U.S. I've met quite a few of them on this trip, and their commitment and passion is very admirable and makes me want to try to seek out those local cider producers. And then meeting and tasting the local cider in France has made me really want to try to expand what we can see in our grocery stores and our liquor stores to make more variety available. We have great big commercial producers, but I want more. I want to see more. I was fascinated with the process, the pride the people took in their farms and the product they produced, and everyone has a different angle, which is very intriguing. I have an ag background, so I understood most of the process and how the farms worked, which was good. And generally, I just liked the drinking on the tour. We got such a variety and such a quality. You can never replicate this. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for anyone who's a cider grouper, a producer, or an apple grower. I highly recommend it.
I like that cider grouper.
I'm a groupie.
A groupie?
I
like being a cider grouper.
The grouper was the Calvados talking.
That was our dear Tina on the bus of the French Cider Tour, telling you why it is a good idea to check out this tour and sign up today. You can find the reservation link at ciderchat.com. Go to the tab that says a Totally Cider Tour. Up next is our featured conversation with Dan Gallagher. He'll be bringing us through his cider log, and you can use it too because he has provided Cider Chat with a PDF that you could download and fill in yourself for any cider you're making moving forward. And it's going to be available in the show notes for this here episode 407. So just check that out, download it, and print it out, because I already have printed mine out and I'm making copies for any cider I'm making at this point. And I want to say I wish I had this kind of info when I first started fermenting, because it's this type of info that helps us all become better cider makers, keep better records that then we could refer back to over and over again and keep upping our game. So it's so wonderful that he reached out and said, "Hey, Rhea, I'd like to offer this." And he will be telling you why he wanted to do this. So you could wait for that. And if you want to watch this entire conversation as we have up on the screen the actual form there, go to the Cider Chat YouTube channel, because this conversation right here is all in a video format at the Cider Chat YouTube channel. And while you're there, please do subscribe and like the video and all the other videos there. There's like over 400 plus videos. Also shorts. Every like really helps bring cider into the forefront. It's all these little steps that we kind of keep on pushing each other along to get what we love be seen to the rest of the world and pull everybody else along into our happy party too. So without further ado, I'm going to invite you to grab a glass and join this chat with Dan Gallagher of Frosty Twig Cider, based in Canton, New York. I had the opportunity to meet you, Dan, at the New York Apple Camp, which took place in 2023. And more recently, you sent me some info on some of your record keeping and everything you're doing out there. So got a lot going on. I want to bring listeners up to date on who you are in that welcome to the program here, and tell us a little bit about your journey to cider making and where you're going with that. So let's begin there.
Okay. I've been making cider since about 2017, which is when I bought the property where I currently am that has maybe 70 or 80 old. And when I started looking at the apples on the trees that first fall, I was like, I'm not really sure what these would be good for. And I thought maybe a hard cider would be something to try and use them for. And so even that first winter, trying to pick some that were already, frozen on the tree there and try and use those. And then really I think that second fall in 2018, really delving in to try and ferment it into hard cider.
Did you have a passion for, and you were saying hard cider, I just call it cider. Did you have a passion for cider prior to this? Was this something that you were pretty familiar with?
Definitely with apples, yes. I'm from Central Virginia originally and grew up Central Appalachia, foraging a lot in the summer for berries. We had quince tree actually in the front yard growing up, apples, blackberries, pears, everything's nearby. And when I was in high school, actually, I worked at a really large apple and peach orchard in Central Virginia. So I think the apple part of it goes back a long way, but not so much the hard cider part and the cider part.
So the actual making of the cider was something that you've gotten your skills more recently?
Yes,
then.
Absolutely.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And is that book study or hanging out with people or taking courses? How did that come about?
I definitely self-taught and definitely reading a lot of books. I didn't find a lot of the information I found online particularly helpful. I think, and we can chat about that as we look at the record keeping. I think there's a lot of conflicting information or people that are very passionate that cider has to be made one way versus another way. And so I think looking through a lot of those different styles and ways of making cider, I was like, how can I teach myself? Not really having a mentor about going into this. And certainly I think the books helped a lot, but I think just trying things and seeing how they turned out and tasting them and saying that worked or that didn't work was really, I think, that early first 2 or 3 years.
I want to get into that point about different voices coming in. Why don't you say a little bit more about that?
I think when you look through a lot of the social media, you'll see these short snippets of things or read blogs or see posts. And a lot of times I see maybe a homemaker or a hobby maker post a question about a particular style or, hey, this is my first time doing this. And then you'll see 30 or 40 different answers because it is an art and it is a science. And I think while there are certain things you want to not do or do, there's also not one right answer. So I think when you're just starting out and you see a lot of conflicting data, and maybe you're not sure about what direction you want to go in or what's the best method or how long to age something, or also a lot of questions on people looking at the visually, right, through the carboy wall. Is this normal? Is that normal? Is this normal? Is it foaming too much? Is it not foaming enough? With any fermentation, it seems daunting. And then once you delve into it, you're like, oh, it's really not that much. As long as you avoid a couple key things, it's going to do its own thing, and you learn the more you do it.
I've been making cider for a really long time, and still, and especially via Cider Chat, I'm still learning so much. And it's evolving too, isn't it? We're hoping, I think, Dan and I, on this episode here, to give listeners out there who are approaching cider making some tools, maybe a baseline to approach it from.
So I think a lot of it also, whether it was 500 years ago or now, is looking around in your environment and seeing what's available to add into a cider or do a co-ferment or anything like that. Especially, let's say there's like an early variety apple that's not particularly interesting. I know a lot of makers out there shy away from those early ripening varieties of apples. But I've noticed there's so much in the environment that's ripe around that time, late summer, early fall, from blackberries to elderberries, chokecherries, aronia, all these things that can add a lot of depth and flavor and tannins and everything into your cider as well. And I think probably our ancestors were doing the same thing, right? If they throw fruit in and see what happens.
Yeah, definitely. You reached out to me and you showed me a cider log, and I'm going to bring that up on the screen now because I thought this was interesting. And just for listeners who aren't seeing this visually, and we'll have this on the show notes for Dan's episode, but I do know that I'm going to be posting up on the screen. First, the one that he actually filled in a form here. It's called Frosty Twig Cider Log. Your record keeping here. What are you looking for when you are making I'm going to call it a batch of cider?
When I made this document, I tried to put everything I might use on there, even though every batch is going to be a little different. So whether it's a single varietal or you're doing a blend at the beginning, you're doing a blend at the end, you're doing a co-ferment, you're doing a wild fermentation, you're doing a pitched cultured yeast, to try and allow for space to write all of that down so that I had the most amount of flexibility, knowing I might just put an X or leave it blank. I'd rather remind myself in the moment as I'm making a batch, thinking about each of these steps as I go along. Because I think once we're like in the cellar and in the moment and you've got the open carboy or you've got the star san open, then you don't want to be running around trying to find the things. So sometimes looking at ahead of time, just making myself sort of a mental checklist of what do I need? Do I have everything in place? Do I have the equipment? Do I have the siphon hoses and all that stuff? And I tried to leave
You don't have that checklist here. That's like another checklist to have, isn't it? What equipment to need at that specific time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I tried to leave the most. I read through this and I can jog my memory, but I think, adding a second page, maybe any kind of cheat sheet, I'm a big fan of those things that you jog your memory or remind yourself in the moment where you're at.
Because this is a visual and we're doing audio and a little visual. Let's start at the top line. So you have batch and you wrote 16W and there's a space to write, like, I guess the batch number, what you're calling it. So what are you talking about when you say 16W?
So normally I just start at 1 with my numbering and just go as however many batches I have. And then usually with the lettering, it might be some sort of mental jog about what it is. With the W in this particular case, it was a wild ferment. Okay. But it might be B for berry or whatever else we're doing.
All right. Yeah. So you have to have your own kind of categorizing. You have to be a good file keeper for sure. And then right next to the top, it says batch size. So it says you wrote in 5 there. So I'm thinking that's 5 gallons.
Yeah. A 5-gallon carboy there.
It says press date. So that's a press date, which could be different from the pitch date of the yeast.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have a carboy date as well, because one of the things I started playing with this year was actually doing some maceration as well. So the press date when you actually press your pomace might be different than when you actually move it into your vessel.
Okay, so in this case, it says 10/9/22. So we're looking at October 9th, 2022. And then there's two columns. So I believe we probably would start on the left column. And let's talk about that first box there. What do you call in that first box? Variables and ratios.
Yeah, I have different, any apple variety that you might use. So if it's a single, you could write in golden russet. Sometimes I'll put in different ratios, pretty vague. You can be as specific or as loose as you want to there. So it might be 1/3 Cortland, 2/3 wild crabapple. And then I have a place there for recording the pH as well.
So in this case, it says FT plus forge, mix, and wild. So what's your script there? What's FT mean?
That would be Frosty Twig.
Frosty Twig, okay.
Yeah. As I mentioned, I have planted a lot of apple trees here on the Frosty Twig, but many of those are not producing just yet. So if I started in 2017, 2018, hopefully we'll start to see some of that fruit coming in shortly. But I do have 70, 80 wild apple trees to pull from. So anytime I have that Frosty FT or Frosty Twig, that would be stuff I picked from on the farm. And then forage is usually within a mile or two of the farm, just driving the country roads, finding those hedgerow trees. So you can add as little or as much data there as you want.
Yeah, I like it. And we're going to peel away what you're doing with this particular cider. And it also says wild. So yeah, that's the way Dan's setting it up, whatever kind of fits your scenario, right? If you're sourcing it from a particular orchard, it's probably a good idea to write down what the name of that orchard is so that you can follow up if it worked well, or maybe there were some nutrients or the pH was different from one orchard to the other. And in this case, this batch called 16W had a pH of 0.2.
Maybe on the lower end of what I'd like to see, but in that butter zone.
Yeah, no doubt. So then we go down the list here, and now you have the carboy date below that one, and it's the same date as the pressing, so you put it directly into the carboy, I'm assuming. See, I wasn't even there, and I could read your script and know exactly what you're doing, which is a nice thing too. Mm-hmm. And in that same box, you have Camden tab. So that is the metabisulfite that one might or might not add. And in this case, you wrote what I could see is no, you didn't add anything. Is that typical for you? I'm just curious about your cider making style there.
Not necessarily. I think this year I actually, and by this year, 2022, the year that I did this, I did a batch where I said, hey, let me start with 40, 50 gallons in a big barrel so that it's all one type of juice and remove every variable except the yeast. So maybe I tried, I think it would be 9 or 10 carboys. So take that juice, put it into 9 separate carboys. So all of those variables are the same. And then try my control in this particular case would be that wild ferment. And then eight different pitched yeasts and just focus only on that. So try and see what happens and how the yeast affects the flavor, the fermentation, and all of those things. I do a fair amount of wild fermentation, but I wouldn't say it's certainly the only thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Not everybody has the luxury of just doing one specific way with the apples that they're sourcing, whether it's from their own property or beyond. So that's pretty classic there. All right, we're going to keep on going down this list here. The next box, and I'm pulling up my phone because it's a little far away from the screen here so I can see what you have there, but you have the pitch date and the temperature in that box. Any reason why you put pitch date and temperature? And this is for beginners to know this. What's the reasoning behind that?
I think if you're adding those sulfites early in the process, you definitely want to wait at least a day or two before you pitch your yeast in there. So that's, again, just a check that if I were putting those sulfites in to kill any wild yeast, that I have waited a day or two. And I don't always remember what date I put it in and what day I'm in pitching yeast. That's why I have that on there.
Yeah, that's a really good point there. You don't want to pitch if you're using a cultured yeast right after you put in metabisulfite. And so the temperature here, what he put in the box was wild for the pitch state. So that's a wild yeast, and the temperature was 65 degrees, which is warm, but yeast want warm to start munching away on all the tasty apple sugars. Mm-hmm. So cool, good box there. The next box down below is you have two things in here. Again, it's tasting notes and look. So that's the visual there. And the tasting notes, I love how you wrote this. It says, appley good. And then in the look section, you wrote, in blue carboy. Oh, no.
I do have one carboy that has blue glass, but it's a light enough blue that often I get a little panicky when I don't remember because it makes the cider looks an odd off color. So I try and note that when I use that one.
Well, that must be like an artifact, like blue. I have a greenish tint to one of my carboys, which is, I know it's old. And that one, like, I wonder what that was used for, medicinal or something way back when, right? Probably. Who knows? All right. So now we go down and here's some like very critical things. In the next box, it says soft SG, which is soft SG stands for specific gravity, and then it also has sugar type. So what do you mean by soft specific gravity there? And the specific gravity is a ratio of sugar to solution. I'm going to just say it like that. That's the easiest way to make it for beginners. And just for the total Apple science folks, he has here 1.050. And he put no for sugar. But let's just talk, why are you calling it soft specific gravity?
I think it's just to differentiate between a soft and hard, which was originally my sort of thinking about it. But it's essentially your starting gravity. Starting gravity.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd never heard it called soft, but I like that. It's like leaning into the cider. And no sugar was added, but this would be where you put if you're adding any kind of sugar. Mm-hmm. You have post-specific gravity, and you have an X underneath that, and then sugar added. Again, I think that is saying no, but I'm not sure. I can't read your script there. Is that
no?
Okay. Yep. So post, is that looking for final gravity there?
Right. That would just be if you added some additional sugar to bring your level of that starting specific gravity up, then I would take the starting gravity of just the sweet cider, soft cider, starting without any additions first, and then measure it again with the hydrometer if I've added additional sugar and write that number down as well.
Perfect. Okay. And so just for listeners out there in Ciderville, we're geeking out here a little bit. So just follow us along. Again, maybe your best bet is to open up the show notes for this here episode with Dan Gallagher of Frosty Twig, or go, perhaps it might be up on YouTube and you could watch it there in real time, pre-recorded real time at least, to see what we're talking about. But these are really critical things for cider making. A lot of people think, oh, you make cider, you just throw in a jug and voila, which is what I do. But if you want to follow your path, you do want to take records. It's like marking the mark on how you grow over the years. And then as you get to a certain point in life, you start marking how you start shrinking over the years. I haven't shrunk yet. Okay. All right. Going further, the next box has acid blend and pectin enzyme. So here you put in 1 teaspoon and then of the acid blend, and the pectic enzyme you have, it looks like 2.5 teaspoons. Mm-hmm. So these, again, not everybody adds anything. Some people do. This is Dan's choice to do that, but this is where you would want to know your measurement. You want to say more about that?
I think a few of these things I've since stopped using. I'm like exploring the less input method, but I think, again, this is probably earlier on. I think as you do these things and you read, again, advice online about, if you're using store-bought juice or you're not sure about the source of particular things, you should add some of these things in to cover your bases. And certainly I think if on this batch, I probably would leave a few of these things off, especially that acid blend here. If we've already got a pH of 3.2, we probably don't need that in there. So
yeah, you're so right. When I first started making cider, you got to add that pectic enzyme. You got to do that. You got to measure and that, and especially when you're doing like wild ferment. And I think this will resonate with a lot of makers out there who know the orchard. They've been doing it for a while. You have a general sense. You don't do a lot of this. You just let it go. But certainly, I think it's always good to start from ground zero and build up your skills, get your confidence. Obviously, this was made in 2022. We're in 2024 recording. So your learning curve has really shot up in a very short amount of time. Have you tasted this cider? Is it bottled and are you happy with it?
Yes and yes.
Hey.
I think with any of them, I think one of the reasons why I like to do this is really, I do flip back. I have a binder for every year. So I do hole punch these and keep them so that I can look back. I think especially because often if we're waiting 6-9 months, maybe a year or more between when we made it and when we're tasting it, we might not, at least I don't, always remember what I did. So I find some of these things really helpful and say something turned out really great. What do I think that maybe is? And if I've done a compare and contrast where I've had 2 batches that are very similar with only one difference, that might be an indicator versus maybe one of those times where something isn't so right. Either it goes bad or there's just an off tasting note or it's too sharp or whatever the case might be. You again can look back and make those small corrections. So hopefully every batch is getting a little better and you like it more as you go.
Yeah, absolutely. The next box has yeast nutrient and yeast, and it looks like you put 5 maybe teaspoons in there. Is that T for teaspoons? Now, yeast nutrient is, again, something you got to put that in, especially as a beginning cider maker. And you're looking at all these things you need to buy. You thought you just could get juice, and now you got to get pectin enzyme, acid blend, and yeast nutrient and all that. How often do you add yeast nutrient now? Is that
probably about half the time? And I think some of it might also go to the variety, how late into the year those varieties are. Probably if I'm adding 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or more different types of apples, I'm probably less likely to add that in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I can't remember the last time I added yeast nutrient to any of my ciders. I don't know. It just doesn't cross my mind anymore to do that. And of course, I'm not going commercial, so that's a totally different ball game. I'm doing primarily wild ferment and sourcing from the same place. So that goes back to that original statement. But this is something to consider. So the last box on the left side says ferment description. And you have 1016 starting. So let's explain to listeners what you mean by that. Remember, he pressed this on October 9th.
Mm-hmm. So usually I try and put a date. I've since started adding other dates as I go, try and take a visual at a couple points during that primary fermentation, just again to get a visual how fast it's starting. Is it super active? Has it coming up through the airlock? And that will also help me adjust headspace for that primary and take the temperature and take the literal temperature and see how that is affecting that ferment, whether it's cooler or warmer. And you can also look across all your carboys if you started them at a similar time and see where everything is and how fast the yeast is producing.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So there will be an updated form on the show notes for this episode because Dan has already tweaked it and we don't have that one here. So this is again from 2022. So now we're going to go to the top of the right side of this script here. And he has in that box he has three boxes in a row. The first box says first rack date and temperature, and then it goes second rack date and temperature, and then third rack date and temperature. Dan, how about if we explain to folks out in Ciderville what you mean by rack first, just for the total non-cider makers out there?
Sure. Essentially, after primary fermentation is ending, usually I'll siphon the cider from one vessel to another, obviously from the vessel that it's in to a clean, sanitized vessel, normally leaving the lees at the bottom. So you move it into secondary fermentation there.
And the lees are the dead yeast cells. And I also happen to call it schmutz sometimes, a little bit of schmutz on the bottom. You want to get it off. It's like a little thick layer of and it's called the lees, of course. Now, in the first rack date, you press this, it started fermenting on October 16th, and you racked it over on December 13th. So that's right on. And that's somebody who tells, I look at that and I go, oh man, this guy's paying attention to his cider versus me. I'm in January saying, I'm going away for 2 months. I better rack over my cider now. But is that like your kind of pattern? Are you finding like a 2-month period or?
Yes, but I think it also has to do just with life. So I'm also an educator. So often I find that my cider schedule somewhat corresponds to the academic calendar as well. So if I have a winter break, that's when I have a month off, and that's when I can do a lot of work on this. And then you'll probably see as we talk about our second and third here, usually if there's a spring break in there and I have time, I'll try and fit it in. Otherwise, it'll have to be in after the semester is over and I have time to actually get to it.
I see that there's no second rack date. There's nothing in there. That's totally empty. And then we go third rack date. It's in June now, June 10th, 2023. Mm-hmm. So did you find it really totally cleared out by then? Because in the next box, you have bottle date, and that was the same day you racked it and bottled it the same day. It must have been totally clarified or to the point that you liked it.
Yeah, usually I probably did do a second rack date, but I'm always not the best, even myself, the best record keeper. So it probably happened. Otherwise, I would have put the third under the second there. But yeah, I definitely try and rack right before bottling as well. Just if there's anything at the bottom there, I don't want to accidentally stir up in the bottling process.
Yeah. And so I'm going to dig into this a little bit more. So as Dan mentioned, you're siphoning it over from one vessel to another and taking it off the lees. And each time you rack it, this is a way to keep on clarifying your solution more and more. And as you get further towards, that mark, if you started in October, now you're looking at June, and you did a couple rackings, and I might, like yourself, do 3 rackings over the course of that time, you're going to find less and less lees on the bottom. And that clarifies it. And a commercial maker might just put it through a filter and just filter it out. And what you're trying to do there is have clarity and also bottle stability when you're doing commercial. Not all commercial makers do that, of course, but many do. In this case, this is a 5-gallon batch, so it's really easy to rack it over in that way. You have bottle date on June 10th, 2023. And at that point, I believe now you're taking the specific gravity at that point of bottling. That's the next box down. Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about that, about the specific gravity. What are we looking for when we are bottling at that point?
It depends on if you want something that's more with a little residual sweetness. If you're doing a pet nat, if you're going totally dry, you could get that level. And that will also tell you what your ABV, you can compare the starting gravity to the ending gravity there and get your ABV level.
So with I'm going to call it the original gravity, and he had it here as soft gravity. That was 1.050. And the end gravity he has here as 1. So it's 1.000. And at that point, you're pretty much guaranteed that it's fermented out at 1.000, and you're not going to have to worry about the cider re-fermenting in the bottle. I like doing pet nat, so I won't necessarily go down to 1.00. I might bottle a little bit earlier, but at that stage, you're pretty much A-okay. And we do have episodes on watching out for what is called bottle explosions. I'm not going to use that word. It's spelled B-O-M-B. It's dangerous. You have to we laugh about it. It is funny to think about in one way. I remember my parents making root beer and having that down the root cellar kind of going. Glass breaking out of high pressure is really dangerous. So that's what we're talking about, specific gravity. We have episodes talking about that if you want to dig in deeper. The other thing that you have in this box here is ABV, which stands for, why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Alcohol by volume. So again, you can use your starting gravity and your ending gravity to figure out how much alcohol is actually in that particular bottle.
And in this case, what did you have here?
I had about 6%, which is usually, I think, between 6 and 8 is where I usually find that my batches end up.
Yeah, wonderful. And also in that box, you have a little spot where you could put flavoring, if there was any flavoring added. So what, for non-cider makers, what do you mean by flavoring? What would be added there classically?
It could be any sort of fruit juice. I've seen people add any kind of like apple flavoring if they were going to do that, ginger, spices, aromatics, herbal additions, anything that you wanted to add there as you got right before bottling.
But there was none added to this batch. So the next box, you have sugar and also fake sugar in that. So tell us what you're talking about there, the difference between sugar and fake sugar. I like
if you're doing any kind of priming, so in this particular case, this would have been a still cider, but I wanted a little bubble in there, giving something for that yeast to wake back up and make a little carbonation. So you could use a lot of different things there. In this particular case, I added a half cup of dextrose to the entire carboy, stirred it in so that when I bottled it again, that added a little bit of carbonation there. I think I've changed the fake sugar to like any kind of back sweetening, really, which could be any number of things in there as well, but you could use any kind of non-sugar or sugar additive or anything like that if you wanted to add sweetness in there. Again, I tried to make as many columns as possible for the most amount of use there.
Yeah, I could think of so many times I've been making cider. At the end, I'm like, oh, let me throw in this or let me try that. And how much sugar did I add if I added that, as you're saying? And having that marked down is really important because what do your friends ask you when you bring a bottle of cider to share? What apples? What did you add? And you're able to go, I'll just bring it up here on my phone and I have it exactly. That would be a beautiful thing. I'm always like, I can't remember. It's wild. It's all wild. Is what I tell everybody. The next box says tasting notes. And we go back to that descriptor called look. And so let's talk about what do you have in the box there?
So for under my tasting notes, I, at least at this point, thought it was pretty delicious and appley, which is good. Because sometimes when you get those drier ciders, you're not getting some of that real fruity flavor coming through. And then, just some sort of visual descriptor as to the color, if it's a straw or a darker amber or a golden color as well. In this particular case, I believe I use a brown bottle. So once it goes into that bottle, I no longer have that ability to really see what it looks like.
Well, we do know that the longer cider sits around for a while, the darker it typically gets in color. Even if it goes in a brown bottle, you're able to go back to your notes. And if you pour that in or into a glass like 5 years later, and it's a very dark amber, and originally it was like, as you have here, a pale golden, you might be looking at maybe some oxidation or just an aged cider, and the whole profile is going to be changed at that point, certainly to a certain degree. What about aroma? Did you have anything for aroma or the bouquet? It's not on here, I see, but is that something that you've added to the new script?
It isn't, but it probably should be. I think perhaps if I didn't add it in, or I've written in under tasting notes, maybe something like that. But then that's a great thing, I think, to possibly add a new column there. I think I always get a little nervous when I have something open. I'm always trying to limit the amount of time I'm introducing oxygen in to the scenarios.
Yeah. I don't know about you, buddy, but when I'm racking over cider or I'm bottling, the first thing I do is I always pour myself a glass. I start there while I'm bottling and dipping and all that. So there's always a little bit of extra cider. Am I the only one that's doing that? You do that too, right?
I'll usually go and get one from last year. So I have a cold carbonated cider to join while I rack over or bottle.
All right. Okay. I guess I'm maybe unique in that way. I don't think so. I think there's other folks who are like racking over and drinking it while they're going. Yeah. Oh, the times I could recall doing that. All right. Let's keep on going down this list here. This is a great one. I really like this. It says bottle yield, and you put down 51. So I'm assuming those are 12-ounce bottles, out of a 5-pound carboy. That's and that would probably be a good thing to put in there. Bottle yield, 51 bottles, 12 ounce for size.
Absolutely, right? If you're using a 750 or whatever size bottle you're using there, or it would be good.
Yeah, because a lot of us have a couple different size carboys. So I have a 6.5, and I even have a 5.5, like weird size. They're not all, they look the same sometimes, but they're not the same. So especially for us like home cider makers, that really comes in handy. And label name, there's nothing on a label name. What do you mean by that?
So if you had a name that would go on the label, Farmhouse Blend or Scrumpy or whatever fun name you wanted to add to your label there, at that point, I think the batch and the label are now separate things. So that would allow you to just track across. If you have a particular label, you can match it back to that batch number and match that record out. Whereas so far as getting the commercial license, that's in process for this coming fall. So I'm really excited about that. But up until this point, usually what I ended up doing was just making a blank label that says Frosty Twig Cider. It has a blank space for the ABV, and then a big open blank space in the middle where I could write the batch number on there. I found as I was doing some of these tests and trials, I didn't want to think of a separate name for maybe 30 or 40 different things about, let me give this one a clever name and what should the graphics be? I just said, let me make one label for all of them. And that way I'm not bummed out if something doesn't turn out or it's not my favorite or
Yeah, that's really smart of you. Cool. And the last box on this page here, at least this page, says carbonation and notes. And it's blank. So what would normally go in there under carbonation?
So I've since moved all of this into a separate database, and then I'll try and give myself maybe 3 or 4 different tasting dates. So maybe taste it 2 weeks out from bottling, a month out from bottling, 2 or 3 months out from bottling, and just see how it's progressing, how it's aging in the bottle, what level of carbonation is there. Are there any off flavors? Are there other notes that are coming through that I particularly like? So again, if you wanted to add them here, you certainly could. I've since moved them off, so I have a little bit more room to write in all that information as I go.
Yeah. I wish somebody had offered up something like this to me when I first started making cider, because I go back into my notes, and my notes go back many years, and it's really basic. It's just where I got the juice from or the apples, the specific gravity, sulfite or no sulfite, and the yeast. I didn't write down temperature. I didn't write pH. I didn't do any of that stuff. And then I'll just put in like a rack date. But I think the temperature, all that is like really critical because it can so shift depending on where you are making your cider. If you're in an apartment, or if you have a cellar, or if you have a heated cellar, or your life changes and it gets moving. If I had this, I think it would have brought me like up-leveled my cider making a lot quicker. And that is something I miss. So I really love that you did this here. What have you added to the sheet that we're missing? Is there, and I'm going to bring up a clean sheet here.
Okay.
This one here. And anything here?
I don't think I added so much as I just tried to clarify some of the terminology because, again, maybe I've just learned a little bit more or tried to make it clearer so that if other users out there wanted to use it, it would be a little easier to read and just try and think about what might someone else use if they were interested in doing it. And I do find as I'm self-taught and trying to learn and teach myself, I think this was particularly helpful as a way to really look at, because there are so many variables that go in to making ciders, about doing a trial and just testing just temperature, testing just a particular yeast. And that way just comparing and contrasting and learning as I go. And I think as I look forward into becoming a professional cider maker and becoming licensed and doing bigger and bigger batches, I'll probably lean on this as a crutch, but also know that I have it in case I do want to just do a wild co-ferment trial and just see, and even go back to some smaller carboys and see how things turn out before I move up to a really big.
First of all, I want to say I love the name Frosty Twig. It's really inviting. It's cozy. And what's the story behind that name?
So when I bought the Frosty Twig farm, which did not come with that name, it was actually the coldest day of the year. So mid-December, I believe it was like 20 below zero on that move-in date. And very early in January, super excited about the property, walking around and seeing apples still hang on the tree. And I guess we'd had an ice storm, but I have a picture of a tree that I took with that apple covered in ice with sort of the frozen drips hanging off the branches and the apples. So that's where I came up with the name.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me. That's what I figured. So let's inform listeners. This will be up on the ciderchat.com. We'll have links to Frosty Twig, so you could keep on following Dan's journey as he's going along. We're looking at the fall of 2024 for your commercial license, so that will be wonderful. Big celebration time. And use this episode this week. If you are into making cider, if you're starting out, this is a really good place to start. Probably if you're a commercial maker, you're already taking copious amounts of notes, I'm sure. We would hope at some level, right? Because you need that for the feds and all that. But this is a really good place to start. And so use tools like this are being offered up here on this episode today to really up-level your own skills. Anything else you want to say about that? Because we started off this conversation just noting how much info there is, and sometimes some conflict. Not everybody agrees, and many different kinds of books too on the topic.
I think you're right on, and I think the greatest thing so far that I've learned about cider, and I know I shared this with you as well, is there's a real community out there of this whole like rising tide lifts all boats thing. So I think whether it's myself or another cider maker, reach out to them and run ideas by them. But something I wish I would have done maybe earlier in the process, but not really knowing where to turn, or if I did turn, finding a lot of conflicting information or just like data overload on different options. So I just want to encourage everybody to try it. I know you've got some great episodes on just starting with 1 gallon juice and starting your first batch. Yeah, there's fruit everywhere out there, whether it's from a local orchard or cidery or just on a roadside tree that you find. Yeah, just be great as a tool, maybe for new makers to go out and try their first batch.
And you don't have to become a commercial maker to make cider. I think it really informs your palate by making cider. Then you get to look at the commercial offerings out there and really have a different idea about what's going on in that bottle, right?
It's absolutely true. And I think one of my tastes have certainly changed since I was in my 20s and 30s with some of those things. And it's interesting now, having made cider, to go back and taste other things that other makers make. And then you're starting to notice a lot of things that you didn't really notice before you started making. cider.
That even leads me to this form that you did. You could say, oh, I made this batch and my temperature really fluctuated. At this point, at pressing, it was either unseasonably cold or unseasonably warm, or I had really high specific gravity. And so the final batch came out a certain way. And then when you taste a commercial bottle of something, whatever, from anywhere in the world, you could say, oh, I think the same thing went on here. They fermented this in too high a temperature. Right? That's part of it.
Yeah, I had a couple batches actually that turned out to have a little bit of like unpleasant bitterness and a little metallic taste come through. And every time I tried to problem solve it, I would Google it. It was like, it may have come in contact with something metal that caused that flavor. And I was like, I didn't use anything metal. I don't understand where this off taste is coming from. And then fast forward 3 years, I read a small note in a book that mentioned it might actually be in reference to the acidity of your cider. And so I was able to compare and go back 3 or 4 years and say, oh, wow, look at that. This cider that I had a note on that had that acidic metallic taste to it was 2.7, 2.8 on that pH. And so some of these things you don't really realize until you're like looking back a few years and, oh, okay, that's something to watch out for.
Yeah, that's a cool part of it. And that's why I think I get so jazzed up about all this. It's limitless. When you want to be in a craft where you're always being challenged, you're always learning something, it's never dull. And really, truthfully, the best part for me is like meeting the people out there in Ciderville like yourself. So let's bring folks up. I'm going to take down that and bring us back up here. Tell us a little bit about what we're going to be expecting from Frosty Twig and where we should be following you online at this point.
Sure. As far as that goes, on Instagram at Frosty Twig. So I try and post there fairly regularly. And as far as what's coming up, big news, Frosty Twig and Canton Apples, which is another organization, are gonna be collaborating and joining forces starting this fall. So the nice thing is they really only focus on the fresh pressed apple cider, the fresh juice, and haven't really delved into hard cider. Joel Howie of Canton Apples really wanted to, and he's only a mile down the street. So that's nice. And he's got a commercial facility, a crew of people, the pressing house, a lot of the equipment. And so I'm really excited to move out of my basement and into a commercial space.
Wow, that's huge. Fantastic, Dan. And I'm totally going to be following your story here because it looks like it's already off to a good start. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today on Cider Chat, doing all your offerings and bringing up this topic, which was really critical. I had a whole bunch of episodes that I have rolling out, and then I saw this. I'm like, you know what? This timing, we need to get this out now. So you are the inspiration for that, and I really appreciate what you're doing and this connection today.
Of course. Thank you.
Go to the show notes for this here episode number 407 and get your own copy of The Cider Log, as discussed in this here episode with Dan Gallagher of Frosty Twig Cider, based in Canton, New York. Just go to ciderchat.com, episode 407, and you'll see a little PDF that says click here. That's all you need to do to download it onto your different device and print it out. And then you'll be good to go for your next ferment. Cider Chat is listener supported. That means this here podcast relies on you out there in Ciderville to help keep this podcast rolling out each and every week like it has been for the past 9 years. And there's a number of ways to do that. You could go to the support page at ciderchat.com. And there is a special website called Patreon that helps content creators like myself do this type of work. And of course, there's a page for Cider Chat. And we have different tiers that you could join. So thanks to all the patrons at the Cider Chat Patreon page for helping to support Cider Chat each and every month. There is a commercial level for makers who could join that, and that's called the Cider Going Up campaign. So I want to give a big tip of the glass to the following makers. That is Ross-on-Wye Cider and Perry Company, based in Ross-on-Wye in the UK, Duck Chicken Cider, based in London, Spacetime Mead and Cider Works in Dunmore, Pennsylvania, Insider Japan, Japan's first and only bilingual magazine and also importer and exporter of cider and beer into that country. Esoterra Cider Works, based in Dolores, Colorado. Taddy Bogle Cider Works in Acme, Pennsylvania. Bent Ladder Cider in Doylestown, Ohio. And Press Then Press, that is all about helping you hook up the best ciders online with a hand-picked collection. And the American Cider Association. You too can become a patron today. Just Google Cider Chat and Patreon. That's spelled Patreon. This is Real Wind Caller signing off for now. Looking forward to seeing you in Ciderville.
We like cider. We like palms. We love orchards and having fun. There is a reason. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes, there is. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes, there is. There is a reason why we drink it like this. Oh yes, there is. There is a reason. We like walking through the orchards, dancing in the streets, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet. We like cider, we like palms, we like orchards, having some fun. There is a reason. There is a reason why we do it like this.
Oh yes, there is.
There is a reason why we do it like this.
Oh yes, there is.
There is a reason why we drink it like this.
Oh yes, there is.
There is a reason. We like walking through the orchards, dancing in the streets, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet.
Oh yeah.
We like cider.
Oh yes, we do.
We like palms.
Oh yes, we do.
We love orchards, having some fun. There is a reason. There is a reason why we do it like this.
Ba-da-da-dum.
There is a reason why we do it like this.
Ba-da-da-dum.
There is a reason why we drink it like this.
Ba-da-da-dum.
Ba-da-da-dum. We like walking down the orchards, dancing in the streets, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet.
Oh yeah.
We like cider.
Ba-da-da-dum.
We like palms.
Oh yes, we do.
We like orchards, having some fun.